At precisely 8:57 a.m., Mary stapled a budget variance report while the VP's assistant cried in the break room. You could set your watch to Treasury. Beige cubicles, silent spreadsheets, and the gentle hum of printers still running on settings last updated during the Obama administration. Mary sat in the farthest corner, the corner they never remodeled, next to the supply closet that squeaked when you opened it too wide. Her desk had a real calculator on it, not the app. A Hewlett-Packard 12C with a cracked key and enough financial wisdom baked into its plastic to bankrupt 3 tech bros just by proximity. 12 years. No scandals, no panic, no all-hands tantrums. Mary was a spreadsheet witch. She spoke Excel like a second language and had a sixth sense for sniffing out bad numbers the way a bloodhound finds meth in a trailer park. The kind of woman who could forecast an earnings dip just by how long finance lingered at the coffee pot. And yet no one ever asked her to the cool meetings. That was fine by her. Meetings wasted time and time wasted money. But this morning, everything felt off. Too much cologne wafting in from the boardroom. Too many HR people smiling like they were smuggling news they couldn't wait to ruin your day with. Reorg, whispered Chelsea from payroll. Always knew everything 3 hours before Slack did. Mary didn't flinch. She just sipped her coffee, black, lukewarm, and brewed in a stained Mr. Coffee from the Bush era. A reorg meant budget bloodletting, which meant Treasury would get poked, sliced, and reorganized into some shiny new thing with a pointless acronym and zero institutional memory. Right on cue in swaggered Bradley. VP of Finance, interim dropped by the time his second day ended. Tall, obnoxiously tan, and dressed like his shirt cost more than Mary's car insurance. He shook hands with people like he was sealing NBA trades, high-fived someone from procurement, and then made a beeline to the conference room, where a stack of printed org charts sat like a pile of death warrants. By noon, he had already cut 3 teams, sunsetted an entire compliance project, and told the head of vendor relations to lean out or be left out. At 12:07 p.m., he called a meeting with Treasury. And just before I go any further, real quick, if you're one of the 97% of fine folks who have been listening to these revenge tales without subscribing, now's your moment. A little click goes a long way. Keeps the lights on, the coffee bitter, and our team from turning into another Bradley reorg. All right, back to Mary and her calculator. Bradley walked into the meeting room like a man who'd never filed a 10K in his life, but thought vibes alone could balance a balance sheet. His opening slide? Out with the old. Cute. He used words like streamline and synergy the way a raccoon uses garbage, loud, frantic, and with no idea what any of it means. Mary said nothing. She didn't even blink. She just kept taking notes with a mechanical pencil that had outlived 3 CEOs. Then came the moment. Legacy departments like Treasury, Bradley said, smiling like he was auditioning for Shark Tank, often consume more value than they create. I'm not saying y'all are dinosaurs. I'm saying maybe it's time to make room for new blood. There it was. Chelsea looked like she might cry again. Tim from accounts payable shrank 2 inches in real time. But Mary, she just blinked, flipped a page in her notebook, and waited. And regarding bonuses, Bradley added, flipping to a pie chart that had clearly been designed by someone who thought gradients were personality, Treasury's pool this year is frankly a rounding error. We can reallocate those funds where they'll actually impact growth. He chuckled at his own joke. Mary didn't. She closed her notebook. Neatly, deliberately. Then she stood, walked out without a word, and headed to her desk. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in a Ziploc bag for humidity control, was a leather-bound folder, scuffed, creased, but intact. Its label read, Covenant 329J Maturity Contingent Trigger Clause, signed 6/30/14. Mary pulled it out and laid it flat on her desk like a priest preparing a final sermon. 12 years of silence. Of being overlooked, ignored, brushed aside. Of watching men like Bradley ride up on borrowed charisma and fizzle into LinkedIn motivational quotes after setting entire departments on fire. But this covenant, this was her kill switch. And the funny part? Bradley had already lit the fuse. Bradley hit the building like a Red Bull tornado. Within his first 72 hours, he'd already revamped 3 budget frameworks, renamed 2 departments, and scheduled a mandatory innovation sprint on a Sunday. He wore loafers without socks and referred to himself in the third person during presentations. Bradley doesn't just balance books, Bradley builds futures, that kind of corporate cologne. At first, folks tried to play nice. Mary didn't. She'd seen this breed before. The ones who came in hot with their MBAs and TEGS energy, who talked disruption but couldn't explain cash flow if it punched them in the 401k. Men like Bradley thought speed was strategy and that experience was a liability. To him, legacy wasn't foundation, it was fat to trim. The first time he addressed the Treasury Department, he pointed at Mary and called her a stability asset, which is corporate for antique we can't fire yet. She didn't respond. She just sat there, chewing on a dry corner of her oatmeal cookie, flipping through variance sheets like they were crime scene photos. Bradley's favorite word was relevance. As in, how does this process stay relevant to our stakeholders? Or let's evaluate this from a relevant standpoint. What he meant was, cut it unless it sparkled. and nothing about Mary sparkled. During one status sync, Bradley asked her, on a crowded Zoom call, why she hadn't migrated Treasury over to predictive analytics via cloud-based ledger systems. Mary blinked once and replied, because we like our funds accounted for. The silence afterward was delicious, but humiliation came 2 days later, wrapped in clickbait PowerPoint. A full reorg, complete with a color-coded chart titled Legacy Optimization. That was the day he did it. He marched into the finance leadership meeting, strutted up to the whiteboard, and started erasing names from the departmental funding tree. And Treasury, he said, clicking his teeth like punctuation. Begetting a well, let's call it a gentle reduction. Someone cleared their throat. Bradley grinned. Look, I'm not saying Mary and her folks don't do good work. I'm just saying their bonus pool is what? A rounding error? Chuckles from the interns mostly. The ones who thought sarcasm was strategy. Mary didn't flinch. She adjusted her cardigan sleeve like it was a chess move. Bradley kept going. We've got bigger fish to feed, folks. Product needs velocity. Marketing needs visibility. Treasury, they've been coasting. It's time we prioritize impact over nostalgia. More laughter. Mary stood up, and for a split second, even Bradley paused. She didn't argue, didn't defend her team. She simply said, I'll forward the variance report this afternoon, and walked out of the room. No one knew where she went. But upstairs, tucked in the shadows of the records archive, Mary reached behind a box labeled 2009 Holiday Budget and pulled out a thin, leather-bound folder wrapped in an old scarf that smelled faintly of peppermint and toner ink. It looked unassuming. But inside, paper so old the staples had rusted. The front page, Bond Covenant 329J, Compliance Clause Addendum, Trigger Threshold, Liquidity Coverage Ratios, and Executive Compensation Realignment. Signed by the former CFO, countersigned by legal. Back when they still respected fine print. Mary held it like scripture. It had been sleeping, quiet and untouched, waiting for just the right fool to say just the wrong thing. And Bradley? He had just carved his name into the trigger clause with a permanent marker and called it innovation. It was 2014. Mary had just watched her second CFO in 3 years resign mid-quarter with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. The markets were shaky. Credit was tightening. And corporate, in its infinite wisdom, had just greenlit an acquisition that made about as much financial sense as buying a pool noodle during a drought. That's when the bond talks started. A $68 million issuance. Low-risk paper for long-term investors, meant to signal stability while quietly shoring up liquidity. The suits upstairs wanted it done fast, cheap, and with as little friction as possible. So they turned to Mary, the woman who could thread a liability clause tighter than a nun's purse strings. She spent a week holed up in her office with 3 law binders, 2 calculators, and a thermos of soup that probably violated 3 FDA recommendations. She negotiated the bond personally, every clause, every footnote, every fallback clause buried like landmines in the legal underbrush. And she snuck one in. Clause 14C, buried halfway through Appendix D, disguised in legalese thick enough to choke a paralegal. It stated that if the company's rolling 90-day liquidity coverage ratio fell below 1.25x due to voluntary restructuring, cost-cutting, or asset reclassification, and if executive compensation was increased or legacy bonuses were revoked within that same quarter, the bond would auto-mature immediately. No board vote, no stopgap, no CFO override. The trigger would execute like a mousetrap under a silk rug, silent, sudden, and absolute. And the payout, $68 million siphoned straight from operating cash and wired to bondholders via an escrow system Mary had quietly maintained in an isolated sub-account no one remembered existed. She added the clause not out of malice but memory. She'd seen too many strategic visionaries gut real departments to feed vanity projects, so she left herself an escape hatch, a kill switch, and then she waited. Years passed. CFOs rotated like tires. Budgets shifted. But the covenant slept, dormant and buried in the sort of fine print only someone with a magnifying glass and a grudge would ever find. Until Bradley. He strutted into the building like he was Moses parting a spreadsheet, and within weeks he started slicing. Treasury's bonus pool, gone. Vendor buffers, halved. Departmental reserves, liquidated to maximize runway. And then, the kicker, he approved a reallocation of deferred legacy bonuses to fund a future growth task force. Translation: a think tank of 27-year-olds who ran vision boards and burned money like it was scented. Mary didn't panic. She got to work. She started pulling compliance logs, quietly, subtly, like a ghost auditing its own afterlife. She cross-checked cash positions, recalculated short-term liabilities, and ran simulations in a spreadsheet she stored on a flash drive shaped like a ceramic cat. Then one Friday evening, just after sunset, she stayed late to run final numbers. LCR 1.24x. She blinked. Ran it again, same result. Bradley's budget bleeding had done it. The company had dipped below the threshold. The first condition was met, and by pushing executive incentives while gutting historical obligations, he'd tripped the secondary clause. It was now a matter of when, not if. Mary leaned back in her chair. The office was dark and humming with weekend silence. She opened her drawer, pulled out the leather folder, and flipped to the clause again, finger tracing the wording like it was braille for vengeance. The trigger window opened June 30 at 12 o'clock p.m. It was now June 26, 4 days. 4 days until a ghost clause, written in a forgotten quarter by a woman no one invited to strategy sessions, would silently gut the same man who called her obsolete. She closed the folder, locked it away, and smiled for the first time in weeks. The straw didn't just break the camel's back, it punched it through the earth's crust and lit the remains on fire. June 26, 9:41 a.m. Bradley announced the Beacon Initiative on the all-hands call, a $12.4 million moonshot to rebrand the company with a new digital identity, complete with a TikTok-native content team and a holographic keynote launch scheduled for Q4. $12.4 million for what? Branded foam cubes and a slogan that tested worse than expired milk. The announcement was met with the kind of forced enthusiasm usually reserved for surprise gender reveals at funerals. Mary didn't clap, she didn't even blink. She simply toggled over to the cash position dashboard and watched the liquidity coverage ratio tick down like a dying pulse on a heart monitor. 1.23x. It was done. He'd done it. The final straw had arrived dressed as disruption, bleeding capital into a pet project that would inevitably collapse under its own jargon. Bradley hadn't just walked into the trap. He'd built himself a runway, poured gasoline, and then high-fived the intern holding the match. Mary calmly flipped her page in the ledger and circled a date. June 30. Then she opened a second tab, one that accessed the dormant covenant's execution scheduler. The system was old, clunky, and ignored by everyone but her. Most people thought it had been decommissioned during the last software overhaul. That was by design. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Maturity date, June 30 time, 12 o'clock p.m. execution mode. Automatic notification settings. Disabled. It was all still there, unchanged, waiting. She entered her credentials, triggered a background validation, and watched the ready for release status illuminate like a lighthouse in fog. She stared at the screen for 10 full seconds, then leaned back in her chair. She wasn't giddy. This wasn't revenge in the dramatic, scream into a pillow kind of way. This was math, justice by spreadsheet. By noon, she'd blocked off 30 minutes on legal and compliance's shared calendar. No agenda, no description. Just her initials and a meeting room no one used anymore, the one where the old board used to meet before they got obsessed with glass walls and Instagrammable succulents. She closed Outlook and stood up, walked to the printer, pulled one sheet. Clause 14C trigger confirmation summary signed. 2014 scheduled maturity. 6/30/Roman 20 at 12 o'clock p.m. executed by internal system task auto disperse 329J. She folded the sheet into quarters and slipped it into her blazer pocket like a passport. The office was buzzing about Bradley's big rollout. Posters were going up. Marketing was already planning a launch party. Someone brought in cake, red velvet, store-bought, frosted like they were celebrating a cult sacrifice. Mary declined a slice, walked past the break room. She could hear someone talking about next-gen synergy alignment and felt a small twitch in her eye. That night at home, she took her folder out again. Not to double-check, not to worry, to admire, to remember the moment she outlasted the machine. 4 days, that's all it was now. A countdown disguised as a calendar. She ran one final balance simulation on her personal laptop, encrypted the file, and labeled it Relevance Final XLSX. Then she poured herself a glass of wine, dark red, cheap, honest. And when she toasted, it wasn't to victory. Not yet, it was to inevitability. June 30 dawned sticky and bright, the kind of humid Ohio morning that made air conditioners groan like dying cows. Office was decked out like a frat house that had watched one too many Apple keynotes, banners, branded cupcakes, some kind of LED countdown ticker pulsing beacon launch. T-4 hours. Marketing interns buzzed around with clipboards and ring lights, prepping Bradley's vision address like they were staging a coronation. Bradley strutted through the halls, shaking hands and winking at executive assistants. Big day, he kept saying, big shift. He had a new blazer on, navy with white piping, and a pin that said disrupt or DIE like he was cosplaying a VC vampire. He even had the nerve to high-five the facilities guy after ordering the removal of all department bulletin boards. Mary arrived early. She walked to her desk, calm, steady, expressionless. She wasn't there for the spectacle. She wasn't there to seethe. She was there to finish her work like a woman folding laundry before the tornado hits. By 8:12 a.m., every personal item was gone. No fanfare. No cardboard box cliché, just a methodical dismantling of her workspace. The ceramic cat flash drive was clipped to her keychain. The leather folder was zipped into a gray laptop sleeve. Her desk was wiped down with a Lysol wipe like she was erasing her DNA from a crime scene. At 8:46, she opened Outlook, composed a new email. Subject line, per your rounding error. Attached, a scanned PDF of Clause 14C, the escrow trigger confirmation, and a screenshot of the live execution status, bright green and irreversible. Recipients, General Counsel, CFO, Compliance Director, and CC'd to the full board. Not Bradley. He would find out the old-fashioned way by watching the world around him collapse in real time. She scheduled it for 12:02 p.m. 12:02. 60 seconds after the bomb would silently go off. She closed her laptop, placed her badge on the desk like an offering, and slipped out to the courtyard with her iced tea. No one noticed her leave. The building was too busy filming Bradley from 5 angles while he pretended to innovate. Inside, champagne bottles chilled next to shrimp platters. Bradley was rehearsing a speech about vision capital and synergizing verticals. HR posted a picture of him holding a sparkler with the caption, "Big energy for big change." Beacon Day meanwhile, the financial system, quiet, cold, and deaf to hashtags, ticked toward noon like a guillotine. At 11:52, Mary sat under the maple tree just past the loading dock, sipping from her thermos like a woman watching the tide roll in. Her phone stayed face down in her bag. She didn't check the time. She didn't need to. She knew what noon felt like. Inside, the DJ cued the launch playlist. Somewhere, someone screamed when confetti exploded early and triggered a fire alarm. A junior analyst spilled Red Bull on the final investor deck. The CFO was mid-toast. And at exactly 12:00:01, a silent system deep within the company's financial software executed a transfer protocol tagged 329J escrow release. $68 million evaporated from the operating budget. 3 vendor wires bounced. Payroll stalled. A dozen back-end services froze with a single bland system message. Account locked, covenant escrow initiated. Mary took one last sip, sighed through her nose, and smiled. Somewhere inside, panic had just begun to bloom. The kind that starts small, wait, why can't I log in, before mutating into a full-body corporate aneurysm. She picked up her bag, stood slowly, and began walking. 12 years, 8 CFOs, countless overlooked warnings, and it all came down to 60 automated seconds. And Bradley? He was about to find out that even a rounding error can empty the whole damn tank. 12:00:00 p.m. Somewhere in the humming guts of the company's financial infrastructure, a dormant line of code flicked from if to then, and reality split. 12 years of silence gave way to automation. No fireworks, no alarms, just a cold, irreversible execution. $68 million. Gone. Siphoned from the primary operations account and rerouted to a bond payout escrow like a steel pipe draining a swimming pool in seconds. Liquidity flags shot up across 3 systems. Treasury dashboards lit up like Christmas morning, red, blinking, angry. At 12:00:43, low-level IT alert pinged in the background queue. Transaction anomaly detected. Op Act 01 escrow bond 329J. No one saw it. At 12:01:09, payroll scripts began failing in cascade, salary batches stalled mid-transfer, direct deposits halted, and a contract worker in Texas received a deposit notice for $0.00 and immediately filed a support ticket. At 12:01:47, the CFO's assistant attempted to process an expense authorization for client lunches and got a system error, insufficient funds, contact compliance. By 12:02, 3 vendor wire transfers had bounced. One was for office espresso pods, another for server hosting. The third, a $400K invoice to the branding firm that built the Beacon Initiative logo. All dead in the water. Bradley, meanwhile, was mid-speech. He stood under a giant LED arch that flickered the words "We're building the future," hands stretched toward the crowd like he was blessing their mediocrity. His slides buzzed behind him, chart after chart of projections, none of which accounted for the $68 million black hole now eating the budget alive. Then his phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. He paused, glanced down, Slack texts, a missed call from legal, 4 from finance, 2 from the CFO. One simple message popped up on his screen. What did you do? The crowd watched as his expression shifted, slowly, like a man trying to piece together a language he hadn't studied since college. He lowered the mic, blinked, looked offstage. Inside, the CFO was already on the warpath. Legal was sprinting toward conference room C with copies of Clause 14C printed in trembling hands. IT was desperately trying to trace the trigger. Who authorized this? Why did it fire? Who knew? And sitting just outside under a patch of maple tree shade older than the building itself, Mary quietly unscrewed the cap on her thermos. Iced tea, extra lemon. She always packed it for high-stakes days. She didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. She'd already watched the covenant mature through a second monitor the day before. Watched the countdown like a priest counting down to absolution. She sipped, listened to a crow caw in the distance, adjusted the strap on her sensible shoes. Behind her, the firestorm began. Bradley stormed into finance demanding access to the accounts. The CFO screamed about breached liquidity covenants. Legal pointed to her printouts and repeated one phrase over and over like a spell. It's binding. It's binding. It's binding. No overrides, no reversals, no hero password to stop the bleed. Because this wasn't a hack. It was a design. Quiet, lawful, brilliant trap set a decade ago by a woman who'd been told she was obsolete. Mary reached into her tote, pulled out a paperback mystery novel, and flipped to where she left off. The plot was slow, the pacing clunky, but she liked the way the detective never rushed. Solved things with silence, watched people instead of talking. Bradley would be watching too now, watching his budget hemorrhage, his pet project implode, and his legacy collapse under the weight of his own ignorance. All while Mary sat outside, unnoticed, unreadable, and undefeated. 12 noon had come and gone, and with it the empire of hot air Bradley built on relevance. Bradley kicked open the finance door like a SWAT raid on an Excel spreadsheet. Who authorized this? He barked, holding up his phone like it had personally betrayed him. Inside, chaos bloomed. Monitors glowed with error logs and dead-ended transfers. Someone from Treasury was white as a napkin, clutching a frozen dashboard like it was a Ouija board gone rogue. The CFO was pacing in a tight loop near the window, muttering liquidity thresholds like a rosary. Find the rollback key, Bradley snapped at it. There's no rollback, someone mumbled, not making eye contact. What do you mean no rollback? The head of compliance looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. He rubbed his temples, pulled a binder from the bottom drawer like he was disarming a bomb, and pointed at the clause buried in the documentation. It's a covenant. 329J, auto-executed, signed in 2014. Matured today at noon, triggered by liquidity ratio drop coupled with bonus reallocation. Bradley froze, chest heaving. No one uses that clause. That clause is obsolete. No, said legal, sliding into the room like death with a filing cabinet. It's just old, not void. Binding, executed, fully automated, fully legal. Bradley's hands clenched. Who the hell approved this? Legal flipped to the signature page, scanned it, and said one name aloud like a death knell: Mary G. Eckhart, Treasury Lead. Dated July 2, 2014. For a beat, no one moved. Mary. Bradley's laugh came out strangled, brittle. You mean the woman who hoards binders and uses a calculator from the Cold War? She wrote the clause that just nuked our operations budget? No one answered, because the only thing worse than laughing at Mary was realizing she had laughed last. Bradley stormed back to his office, slammed the door so hard an intern screamed and dropped a tray of branded cupcakes. He sat down, pulled up his inbox, fingers shaking, and found one unread message, timestamp 12:02 p.m. Subject, per your rounding error. No greeting, no explanation. Just the clause, scanned in crisp black and white with a highlighter stroke over her signature. Beneath it, a spreadsheet attachment titled LCR Projection, Beacon Initiative Risk Profile Adjusted. He opened it. The forecast showed exactly what happened, in detail, with footnotes, color-coded, projected, predicted, calculated down to the damn second. And next to the final cell was a small comment box, prediction confirmed. Bradley stared at it like it was a death sentence. His mouth moved, forming syllables that couldn't land. He looked up, and for the first time since he arrived, there was no audience left to impress. No one cared about his blazer. No one wanted his big ideas. They were too busy trying to keep the company from drowning in a $68 million hole that Mary had built for just this moment. He shoved back from his desk and marched to the courtyard. Mary was still there, same bench, same iced tea, same unreadable expression. He stopped 5 feet away, chest puffed like a man trying to intimidate a mountain. You think this is funny? Mary looked up slowly. No, she said, voice flat as a ledger line. I think it's math. You blindsided the entire executive team. She shrugged. You cut our bonuses. I just rounded up. His jaw twitched. This is war, Mary. She looked past him toward the office. Her board members were already arriving early for their scheduled end-of-quarter review. No, she said quietly. This is compliance. Then she stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked past him like he wasn't even there. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The system had already spoken. And it said, Mary was here. The collapse didn't come like an explosion. It came like a slow, methodical bleed, like someone had cut an artery in the heart of the company, and no one noticed until the carpet turned red. By 2 p.m., board members were on site, not zooming in from golf courses, not sending proxies. No, they showed up in person, pale and quiet, holding tablets and scowling at financial dashboards like funeral guests reading an autopsy. An unscheduled disbursement of how much? Why wasn't this clause flagged in our audits? Who the hell approved Beacon without a cash flow revalidation? The CFO looked like a man who'd just learned his yacht was sinking, with his ex-wife at the wheel. Bradley wasn't at the table. He wasn't even in the building. By 3:17 p.m., he had been invited to step back pending internal review. Corporate euphemism for, please sit in a corner while we count your crimes and decide whether to gut you quietly or let HR do it with confetti. His office door stayed shut. Inside, he sat alone, surrounded by unopened gift bags from the Beacon launch party that now felt like birthday presents at a wake. By 4 o'clock, word had reached the investor group. Mary had been right about one thing. When rich people hear the word covenant breach, they don't ask questions, they send lawyers. The inboxes of legal and compliance flooded with inquiries, threats, demands for explanations. One hedge fund sent an email with a subject line that simply read, unacceptable in all caps. No punctuation. Bonuses evaporated by 5:30. The executive suite's Q2 payouts were officially revoked to reinforce fiscal stability in light of recent events. Bradley's severance clause, frozen, his equity package under review, his ego, terminal, and Mary had already gone home. She'd packed her tote, deleted her Outlook signature, and left behind a sticky note for her old desk mate that read, "Don't let him touch the ledger formatting, it'll crash." The house was quiet when she arrived. She fed the cat, watered the plant in the kitchen window, made a grilled cheese with the kind of slow, ceremonial care usually reserved for altar bread. Then just after sunset, she opened her front door to let the breeze in and found it. A small envelope, no return address, cream cardstock, thick, expensive, too nice for junk. Inside, a single note typed, "You were right, no name, no signature." She stared at it for a long time, not smiling, not crying, just existing in the space between satisfaction and something else. Grief maybe, not for Bradley, not for the board. For the 12 years she spent swallowing ideas. For every meeting she wasn't invited to. Every time she was called old school or behind the curve. For all the sharp edges she filed down to keep the peace while mediocrity and expensive suits rode the elevator straight to authority. This wasn't revenge. Not really. It was a correction. A recalibration. A ledger finally balanced. She placed the card next to the folder on her shelf, poured a splash of scotch she'd been saving for when it mattered, and she stood in the doorway, staring out into the cooling dusk, where the last traces of the beacon party hung in the air like burnt sugar and bad decisions. A storm had passed, and Mary, for the first time in years, didn't feel like she was bracing for impact. She felt weightless. 2 weeks later, Mary walked into a modest brick building tucked between a shuttered bakery and a nail salon that still ran Windows Vista at the front desk. No fanfare. No limo. Just her and a briefcase that had carried 12 years of restraint and one perfectly executed trapdoor. The brass plaque beside the door read, Abernathy & Co., accountants since 1972. They'd handled payroll and severance logistics for her former employer for over a decade. Solid, discreet, local. The kind of place no one noticed until the checks stopped clearing. Mary stepped through the door and was greeted by the faint smell of toner and lemon disinfectant. A receptionist, mid-20s, chipper, probably still believing in corporate mentorship, led her to the back office, where a clean desk waited with a thick file folder labeled Ownership Transfer Confidential. The current owner, Mr. Abernathy's son, was retiring early, burnt out, over-leveraged, and more than happy to sell to a cash buyer with no need for financing or partners. She hadn't haggled, she didn't need to. Mary signed in silence. Pen scratches on paper, initials where they mattered. The assistant offered her sparkling water. She declined. Just the keys, she said, and received them with a smile so small it could have been mistaken for courtesy. By noon, the papers were filed. The firm was hers. She toured the small server room, peeked into payroll operations, walked the perimeter like someone checking the fence line of a property she'd already memorized in her sleep. And then, as she reached the file archive, she paused. Top shelf, metal drawer, folder labeled Severance Eckhart Bradley. She pulled it like a sword from stone, sat at the nearest desk, flipped it open. One sheet of paper. Bradley Allen Eckhart title, Vice President, Finance Termination Status, Pending Litigation Review Severance Payout, $0.00 equity vesting, revoked noncompliance clause triggered. She stared at it for a moment. Not out of disbelief, she'd already known. She had designed the conditions. But seeing it there in official ink on someone else's letterhead hit different. It was final. It was clean. It was math. She picked up the sheet, turned slowly to the shredder in the corner. Fed it in. The blades sang. She watched the white lines curl and twist as Bradley's golden parachute turned into silent confetti. Then she whispered, not to anyone in particular, just into the still air of the room, "Your bonus was a rounding error, so I rounded everything else to 0. And that was it. No parade, no press release. No Instagrammable triumph. Just a quiet woman in sensible shoes, sitting in a plain office, sipping weak coffee and smiling at a ledger that finally, had no outstanding balance. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.